What drives the human soul? Is it the yearning to be good or the primal instinct to survive? This question, ancient as breath itself, lies at the root of our every conflict, from the playground to the battlefield, from whispered secrets to public speeches. We are always choosing between two masters, the one who tells us to be kind, and the one who tells us to be careful. From the earliest days of civilization, we've been taught that virtue is strength, that kindness conquers, that truth, despite all odds, will in the end triumph. These are the sacred myths passed down through generations, the lullabies of philosophy, religion, and art. But history, brutal and unblinking, often tells a different story. Empires did not rise on goodness alone. Peace was rarely purchased with purity. And the men who shaped the world, the Caesars, the Khans, the kings and revolutionaries, not only in light, but in shadow, not just in ideals, but in calculated acts of survival. Their words, carved in monuments and inked in parchment, speak of honor. But their hands were often stained with compromise. Somewhere, between Florence's cobblestone streets and the shadowy courts of Renaissance power, one man dared to write the truth that others only lived. A truth too raw for the pulpit, too honest for the poets, yet impossible to ignore. A question, so simple it could fit in a whisper, so profound it echoed through the centuries. Is it better to be loved or feared? That man was Niccolò Machiavelli. To some, he was a cynic. To others, a visionary. But love him or loathe him, Machiavelli held up a mirror to the human condition and forced the world to stare. His question wasn't just a political riddle, it was a moral earthquake. One that shattered classical ideals and cast a long, cold doubt on centuries of ethical philosophy. It asked what most of us are afraid to ask aloud. Can goodness survive in a world that rewards ruthlessness? And it's a question that matters now more than ever. Because we are still choosing, every day, between being the one who speaks softly, or the one who carries a bigger stick. To understand Machiavelli's infamous dilemma, we must descend into a world where the rules are different. A world where power is prized over purity, where deception is a skill, not a sin. A world where the lion and the fox don't fight each other, but walk side by side, cloaked in the velvet robes of a prince. This isn't just dusty political theory. This is the world you live in. But what does any of this have to do with Carl Jung? You see, Jung wasn't just a psychologist. He was something more dangerous. A soul cartographer, a man who dared to map the hidden territories of the human psyche. He believed that every human being carries within them a shadow, a dark, repressed part of the self, not necessarily evil, but primal, raw, unfiltered. The shadow isn't the villain, it's the part of you that says what you really think, that feels what you're not supposed to feel, that wants what you're not allowed to want. It's the hunger beneath the smile, the fire beneath the mask. And in that shadow lies the answer to Machiavelli's timeless question. Why does fear command obedience more easily than love? Because the shadow understands something our conscious mind denies. That fear bypasses morality. It doesn't ask for trust, it demands submission. It doesn't beg to be liked, it forces you to comply. And that's why leaders throughout history, whether they wore crowns or camouflage, have often chosen to rule, not through affection, but through intimidation. Because they knew, consciously or not, what Jung would later describe, that man is not only a moral creature, but also an instinctual one. And instincts don't bow to goodness. They bow to strength. But here's the paradox. The danger. The insight. When we repress the shadow, when we pretend it's not there, it doesn't disappear. It festers. It grows teeth. And one day, it takes over. That's when the smiling politician becomes a tyrant. When the righteous crusader turns cruel. When the savior becomes the monster. Jung believed that the only way to avoid this fate was to confront the shadow consciously. To integrate it. To understand its power without letting it consume you. Not to deny the part of you that wants to be feared, but to know when to let it speak, and when to silence it. This is not just a story about Machiavelli. It's not just a study of Renaissance politics or Jungian psychology. It's about you. It's about the leader in you, whether you command armies, or raise children, run companies, or simply run your own life. It's about the choices you make when no one is watching. About the lines you're willing to cross or not cross when survival is at stake. It's about who you become when the world forces you to choose between being good or being safe. So the next time you find yourself at a crossroads, faced with a choice between speaking truth or staying silent, between showing mercy or showing might, ask yourself, are you choosing from your soul, or from your shadow. And remember, this isn't just history. It's a mirror. And the reflection staring back at you might not be who you expected to see. Part 1. The Man Behind the Mask. Born in 1469 in the turbulent heart of Florence, Niccolò Machiavelli did not come into the world with a crown on his head or wealth in his hands. He wasn't born into nobility, nor did he command armies or inherit empires. He lived not in marble halls, but in the corridors of politics, nestled between power and peril. He was a civil servant, a man of the state, a diplomat sent on dangerous missions, a bureaucrat who understood how decisions were made behind velvet curtains. But beyond his titles, there was something far more important about him. He was an observer of men. Machiavelli had the sharp eyes of someone who saw through appearances. He didn't merely witness events, he dissected them. He paid attention to patterns others missed. He was fascinated by ambition, betrayal, and the fragility of human loyalty. His mind, like a scalpel, cut into the flesh of power and exposed the nerves beneath. The Florence of his time was no postcard of art and elegance. The Italian Renaissance was indeed an age of genius, but it was also an age of shadows. Behind every statue carved and every painting unveiled, there were political deals, deadly feuds, and secret agendas. Florence was less like a museum, and more like a chessboard, where every piece could be sacrificed. The city-state was caught in the violent whirlpool of shifting alliances between the Papal states, foreign invaders like the French and Spanish, and the powerful Medici family, whose grip on Florence waxed and waned like a tide of influence. Machiavelli stood at the crossroads of this chaos. Sometimes he stood in the halls of power, shaking hands with kings and cardinals. Other times, he languished in a cold prison cell, accused of conspiracy, tortured, humiliated, and cast aside like a pawn who'd outlived his usefulness. And yet, he never turned away from politics. If anything, the more brutal it became, the more fascinated he grew. Like a scientist conducting experiments in the human psyche, he watched how promises made in candlelit chambers could vanish with the sunrise. He saw rulers who believed in virtue get devoured by wolves. He saw treachery cloaked in righteousness, and loyalty punished with exile. From these painful lessons, Machiavelli did not emerge with bitterness, but with clarity. He understood something most people refuse to admit: the world was not ruled by ideals, but by actions. It was not goodness that triumphed, it was cunning. And so, from the wreckage of collapsing governments and betrayed ideals, he pulled a single, unflinching truth. If you want to keep power, you cannot afford to be good. Not always. Not in every situation. Not in a world where lions are hunted by wolves. Part 2. The Prince and the Predator. In 1513, in exile and disgrace, Machiavelli sat down to write a small book that would change political philosophy forever. That book was The Prince. Dedicated to the powerful Medici family, perhaps as a peace offering, perhaps as a warning. It was a manual for rulers, written with the precision of a surgeon and the honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. In it, he makes his case with chilling clarity. It is much safer to be feared than loved, when one of the two must be lacking. This sentence is not a declaration of evil. It is a diagnosis of reality. Why? Machiavelli asks, should a ruler base his fate on something as unstable as affection? Love is tender, but it is also volatile. It is a fire that warms, but can fade. It depends on emotion, and emotion is the most unreliable force in politics. People love you when you succeed, but turn on you when you stumble. They cheer for you in prosperity, and abandon you in crisis. Fear, however, is consistent. Fear does not waver. Fear can be managed, measured, and maintained. Fear makes people think twice before betrayal. Fear builds walls that love alone cannot. To Machiavelli, morality was a mask hand. Masks are meant to conceal. A wise ruler does not discard morality, he displays it. He appears just, pious, and compassionate when it suits him. But behind the curtain, he must be willing to lie, deceive, and even kill if the situation demands it. Compassion. A luxury in times of peace, a liability in times of war. Honesty. Ideal in friendship, but foolish in diplomacy. Religion. Not a spiritual necessity, but a political tool. A shared illusion that unites the masses and legitimizes authority. To Machiavelli, a prince must not be good. He must appear good. He must learn to master the art of deception. To blend the virtues of the fox and the lion, to be cunning and strong, strategic and forceful. For in a world where enemies smile and allies scheme, Navit is a death sentence. Importantly, Machiavelli wasn't encouraging cruelty for cruelty's sake. He wasn't advocating sadism or tyranny. His advice was not for despots, but for those who wished to preserve order in a disordered world. He was simply saying, if you want to lead, truly lead, you must understand the rules of the real game, not the fairy tales people tell themselves. And this, perhaps, is why the prince remains so controversial. Because it doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend the world is kinder than it is. It offers not a dream, but a mirror reflection of power as it is, not as we wish it to be. Part 3. The Jungian Dilemma. Now, let's turn to Carl Jung. Jung would say Machiavelli wasn't evil, he was honest about the human psyche. In a world obsessed with virtue on the surface, Machiavelli dared to speak the unspeakable truth, that beneath the polite smiles and noble ideals, lies a storm of raw, untamed drives. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or refuse to confront. It's not just the darker impulses society labels bad, it's everything that doesn't fit the image we want to show the world. Our aggression, our jealousy, our desire to dominate or deceive, they all dwell in that hidden chamber of the psyche. Most people live in denial of this side. They wear masks so convincing that they begin to believe them. They label themselves good, kind, righteous, but behind the scenes, envy simmers, resentment festers, and ambition lurks in disguise. But Machiavelli, he didn't run from this reality. He didn't try to mask it. He embraced it not only in his personal philosophy, but also in the brutal realm of politics, where others saw human darkness as something to be eradicated. He saw it as something to be understood, harnessed, and even respected. He believed that acknowledging the darker impulses of man was not a moral failure, but a necessary step toward clarity. Without that confrontation, rulers would remain naive, unprepared, and ultimately destroyed by the very forces they refused to see. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Think about that. People will sacrifice peace, relationships, entire nations just to maintain the illusion of their own moral purity. They project their inner demons onto others, waging war against shadows they cannot name within themselves. Could it be that Machiavelli was simply more courageous than most? Not because he wielded power, but because he dared to see what others couldn't bear to face. He looked at human nature not as it should be, not as religion or philosophy hoped it might be, but as it actually is: flawed, contradictory, full of beauty and brutality alike. Jung might not have endorsed Machiavelli's conclusions, but he would have respected the depth of insight. Because individuation, the process of becoming a whole human being, requires that we confront the shadow, integrate it, and walk forward with eyes wide open. Machiavelli, in his own way, was an unintentional psychologist. Not of the laboratory, but of the throne room, the battlefield, and the human heart. Part 4. Goodness in Chains. Let's pause for a moment. What happens to a ruler who chooses goodness over fear? History offers us a sobering answer. Think of Julius Caesar, charismatic, generous, beloved by many. Yet in the end, he was stabbed not by enemies, but by friends, betrayed by those closest to him, in the name of liberty. Think of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, a man raised in tradition, who trusted his advisors, his nobles, his people. But when the tides of revolution came, that trust became a death sentence for him, his wife, and even his children. Think of John F. Kennedy, who inspired millions with his vision of a better America. A man who spoke of peace, of dreams, of going to the moon not just physically, but metaphorically. And yet, behind the curtain, shadows moved. His assassination was not just the loss of a man, but of an ideal. In a world where power is always at risk, being good can make you vulnerable. Idealism, in politics, can become a loaded gun in someone else's hands. Because goodness is rarely enough to shield you from betrayal. Virtue, when unguarded, can become a weakness exploited by the cunning. But being feared, that just might keep you alive. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He understood that rulers live in a world of wolves, not saints. He wasn't telling leaders to be cruel for cruelty's sake, but to be realistic, to know when to extend the hand and when to wield the sword. And in a sense, so did Jung. Not politically, but psychologically. Jung knew that the human soul contains light and dark, and that pretending otherwise only invites danger. Just as a ruler must recognize the potential for betrayal in others, the individual must acknowledge the shadow within. A ruler who does not understand fear will be devoured, just as a person who denies their darkness will be consumed by it. So the question becomes, not whether one should be good or feared, but whether one has the courage to hold both truths. To be good where possible, but not blind. To be strong, not naive. To know love, but not at the cost of wisdom. Goodness in chains is tragedy, but wisdom guided by the shadow that might just be survival. Part 5. Fear today. Now, fast forward 5 centuries, from Machiavelli's time. The thrones are gone, but power remains transformed, reshaped, and reborn in suits, screens, and shareholder meetings. Kings no longer command armies with a gesture. Now, CEOs move markets with a memo, and presidents steer nations with a speech. The castles have become boardrooms, and the battlegrounds are digital. But the question still lingers, echoing through time. Do modern leaders rule by love, or by fear? When a tech executive announces mass layoffs while collecting a multi-million-dollar bonus, we recoil. But is it Machiavellian cunning or just market logic? Have we dressed self-interest in the costume of necessity? When a politician warns of an external threat, painting the other as the enemy to unite a divided nation, are they protecting their people, or simply tightening their grip on power? In today's world, fear is no longer just an emotion, it is a tool, a product, a strategy. It's broadcasted through headlines, amplified by algorithms, and sold to us daily. News networks thrive on it. Social media thrives on it. Corporations harness it to build urgency, scarcity, and obedience. Fear has become a language, spoken fluently by those who seek control. And the terrifying truth is, it works. Fear short-circuits rationality. It bypasses thought and goes straight to instinct. It doesn't ask for your consent, it demands your submission. And once fear has your attention, it's hard to look away. But if Carl Jung were alive today, he would raise a red flag, a warning, not just to leaders, but to all of us. He would tell us that unchecked fear doesn't simply vanish. It sinks, it festers, it mutates, it descends into the collective unconscious, feeding the shadow of a culture, giving birth to extremism, division, and dehumanization. Fear, Jung would say, is like a fire. Controlled, it can protect. Uncontrolled, it will consume. It awakens our inner demons, the very parts of ourselves we refuse to see. And when an entire society is governed by fear, the shadow doesn't just rise, it takes the throne. We become nations obsessed with security, but blind to compassion. We build walls instead of bridges. We prioritize punishment over understanding, and slowly, quietly, we stop seeing each other as people and start seeing threats. So the real question is no longer the one Machiavelli asked. It's not just should a leader be feared or loved. It's this: what kind of society are we becoming when fear is our foundation? What happens when fear ceases to be a temporary response and becomes a permanent state? We must ask ourselves, are we safer, or simply more controlled? Part 6. Reconciling the Dilemma. So is Machiavelli right? In many ways, yes. His insights about power were brutally honest, painfully accurate, and disturbingly timeless. He understood that people often respond more predictably to fear than to affection. He knew that the human heart is fickle, and that love can be conditional, but fear can be commanding. But perhaps Machiavelli wasn't wrong. Perhaps he was just incomplete. Enter Carl Jung, the psychologist of the soul, the mapmaker of the unconscious. Where Machiavelli dissected politics, Jung explored the inner kingdom. And in Jung's philosophy, power isn't about domination, it's about integration. Not about conquering others, but conquering oneself. Jung teaches us that each of us contains both light and shadow, both nobility and brutality. To lead wisely, we must first acknowledge the capacity for cruelty within ourselves, not to indulge it, but to understand it, to make peace with it, to prevent it from ruling us from the shadows. True leadership, Jung might say, isn't found in choosing between love or fear, but in understanding their place in the psyche. Love without boundaries becomes weakness. Fear without conscience becomes tyranny. But when both are understood, a deeper power emerges, the power of balance. A good leader may inspire love through charisma and compassion. A wise leader may command respect through integrity and vision. A strong leader may use fear but sparingly, with restraint, like a surgeon's knife, not a butcher's cleaver. But a great leader is an alchemist of emotion. They don't just manipulate feelings, they master their own. They are not driven by love, nor consumed by fear. They wield both, but are enslaved by neither. They can walk into chaos without becoming chaotic. They can stand firm in crisis without resorting to cruelty. They can acknowledge the monster within and still choose to protect the village. Because the ultimate task of leadership is not control. It is consciousness. Closing thought. In the end, the dilemma of power isn't reserved for kings, CEOs, or presidents. It lives inside you every day. Every time you speak to your child with anger or patience. Every time you choose silence or honesty with a friend. Every time you seek influence, recognition, or authority in your work. You are faced with the same question. Will you lead from the light or from the shadow? But maybe the real transformation begins when you stop choosing between them. When you stop pretending one must die for the other to live. When you embrace that you are capable of both. And that greatness lies in wholeness, not perfection. Goodness or fear. Love or power. Shadow or light. These aren't just choices. They're invitations to become more conscious, more human, more whole. Because the ultimate form of power is the courage to understand. And the most dangerous leader is the one who refuses to understand themselves.